John, what was the real impetus for your starting Whole Foods?
Well, I'd like to say there was some brilliant master plan, but honestly, my girlfriend and I just thought it'd be really cool to start our own natural food store. We thought it would be fun. And I'd gotten very interested in organic and natural foods, and I pitched the idea to her to start our own store, and she got real excited about it. I often wonder if she hadn't been excited about it, whether it would have ever happened or not. But she was very excited about it, and we went out and raised $45,000, and we were in business.
Was there a business plan?
We had to write, my dad, who was one of the initial investors, who was a businessman, insisted that I write up kind of a business plan, which I still have, and it's rather amusing actually. But yeah, I did have kind of a business plan, but it was strictly a fantasy. I just made it up.
Was there a time that you realized that what you were doing was a lot bigger than what you thought when you started?
I'm still realizing that, meaning it's, as the business has grown, discover that there are different layers of complexity to it. So it's become a lot bigger as time has passed, as we've come to understand it. It's one of the things I like to say, that purpose of a business, I think businesses have the potential to discover a higher or deeper purpose, and that purpose evolves over time. It gets to higher levels of complexity and meaning. And so yes, it's continuing to unfold in bigger ways than I ever thought were possible. So, and I anticipate that will probably continue.
So you talked a lot about purpose. I want to explore that for a minute, because there's a story in society, a narrative, that the only legitimate purpose of a business is to make money for its shareholders. I know you're a shareholder in Whole Foods. And what's wrong with that story as you see it?
It's an interesting question. First, you have to ask the question, I mean, where'd that narrative come from? I think it's a myth. And who has the right to define what the purpose of a business is anyway? I don't think it's economists teaching at universities that have the right to define that a business must attempt to maximize profits. I do think that's come out of economic theory. But businesses are started by entrepreneurs, and I have known hundreds of entrepreneurs in my life. With only a few exceptions did those entrepreneurs start their businesses primarily to maximize profits for their shareholders. Of course they wanted to make money, but that's not really what was driving them. What was driving them, in most cases, was some type of passion. They were on fire about something. It could be from wanting to, like Bill Gates, to create software that would do the personal computer revolution. It could be the passion I felt with Whole Foods, which was to sell healthy, natural, organic foods to people. There are all kinds of different purposes that can exist. And I believe the entrepreneur who creates the business is the first one who determines what the purpose of the business is. Over time, I do think that purpose evolves or co-evolves through interactions with the different stakeholders, the customers, the employees, the investors, the suppliers, the larger community, all impact the business and help co-evolve the purpose. But I do think it's a myth that the only legitimate function of business is to maximize profits or shareholder value. It's such an interesting perspective, Ed, because that's not the purpose of a doctor, and it's not the purpose of a teacher, and it's not the purpose
hopefully
of...
not.
No, I mean, they have ethical codes. I mean, a doctor takes an oath, and they want to heal people, and teachers want to educate people. Architects want to design buildings. Why is it that we think business refers back to this rather narrow, selfish interpretation of why it exists?
So what happened, or what happened so that we do think that way? Because I do think that myth, I agree with you, it's a myth, but it has some reality in society. You hear a lot of people out saying things like, and profits are bad somehow. that goes with the myth. How did that go wrong?
Well, I don't know exactly how it went wrong. I mean, you have to be an economic historian. But if you look at Adam Smith's initial work, he didn't see it that way. But I do think we were caught up in an industrial age, and as we began to make progress through capitalism, in some ways we had kind of a mechanistic model where you had you take the factors of production, land, labor, and capital, combine those together, and profits spit out. And that was sort of unprecedented in the whole history of our world. And I think in a lot of ways people got caught up with the romance of that you could have a perpetual motion machine. This business could continue to produce profits which would be reinvested in growth, and then more profits would be produced. And so we were sort of fascinated with that fact. And I do think the economists primarily in the 19th century began to create models of the economy that assumed that. They took a very narrow perspective of human nature, that we were these self-maximizers, self-interest maximizers, and businesses therefore were profit maximizers, and it made their models work. And so they began to teach that in their economic textbooks. And then the culture, and then the enemies of capitalism, such as the Marxists and the socialists, began to stereotype businesses as only interested in profit.
So it might be if you actually reread the businesses that were created from the lens of saying, well, I bet those businesses created some value for customers, for their employees, and for their investors, and maybe for their suppliers and communities too. It might be an interesting rereading of what happened over time. Because we read the history of capitalism from this kind of story that doesn't work anymore, the shareholder-centric, economic-centric story.
I totally agree. I think that that has been an interpretation that's been written in to businesses. Again, I've known a lot of entrepreneurs, and I got to talk to Bill Gates a couple of years ago now, and talked about why he started Microsoft, and it wasn't to become the richest man in the world. I mean, he was on fire about, he thought the personal computer revolution was going to transform the world, and that eventually everybody would own a personal computer. And of course, he wanted to write the software for it. And that was his passion, and he was right in predicting what would happen in the world. And as a result, he became wealthy. But that's not why he did it. That wasn't the purpose of it. It was a sort of a happy result of it, that Microsoft became so successful and he became so wealthy. But I do think that this mythology does great damage to the brand of business, because people end up thinking business is only about money. It's only about profit. I constantly have to battle this stereotype that Whole Foods is only about profit, only about money. And it really harms business, is legitimacy, I think, in society.
So you've been the author recently of a new story about business that you call Conscious Capitalism. Mm-hmm. Tell me a little about how you see conscious capitalism growing and evolving, and what you really mean by that.
Well, of course, capitalism is a way of organizing economic relationships. It's a theory about that. And conscious capitalism, at the essence, is becoming more conscious of those processes, so that they're not merely happening automatically through merely the invisible hand, but we become more conscious of how this all works, the greater system of how it all works. And we have identified certain key principles, of which right now I think there are 4 that make up what conscious capitalism is. And first, for the economic system, it's the simple things like freedom of contract, freedom of exchange, the rule of law, and property rights. Those 4 basic principles. They've always been part of capitalism, but we're making that more conscious. And then the conscious business, which exists within the conscious capitalistic economy, has 4 key principles to that, which are deeper purpose. Business has a purpose besides maximizing profits.
And it can be doesn't have to be one particular purpose. There's a whole...
There's probably as many different purposes as there are businesses and entrepreneurs. They can get grouped into big categories, but each of them in some ways is also unique. Secondly is the stakeholder, what we call the stakeholder model, that that you have these major stakeholders who are interdependent on one another. And so the purpose, the leadership's job is to manage the business in such a way as to create value simultaneously for all of these interdependent stakeholders. That also has the happy result of also maximizing long-term profits as well. It's a better strategy for doing so. But it recognizes that all of these major stakeholders are completely interdependent on one another. You cannot optimize one without optimizing other ones.
But that means you can't look at it as making trade-offs among them. Because lots of people will say, yes, great, you've got these stakeholders, but the manager's job is to make trade-offs among them.
Exactly. It's thinking about it in a different way. I always say if you look for trade-offs, you can find them. But if you look for synergies, you can find those as well. So in the conscious business, you're looking for the synergies. You're looking for the win-win-win strategies that will create value for all of the stakeholders. And it's in my opinion, wrong thinking to believe that the zero-sum game is that one benefits another one must lose, is the very thing capitalism sort of proves doesn't have to be the case. That when you're creating value for interdependent stakeholders, no one has to be losing. Even competitors don't necessarily have to lose if you view the competitive interactions correctly, which is your competitors are actually your allies in helping you improve, to helping you get better. They challenge you to move out of your complacency. So it's not a zero-sum game. It's a positive-sum game where all these stakeholders are simultaneously winning. And the other couple of principles that I want to outline in terms of the conscious business are, the third key principle is what we call conscious leadership. And so that the management's job is not primarily self-interested. And too many businesses, leadership today tries to take as much out of the business as possible. It's one of the reasons corporations aren't trusted that well. You have greedy executives who are basically have a view that they want to get as much out of the business as possible. Whereas in the conscious business, the leadership, in a sense, is serving the mission or purpose of the business, serving the stakeholders, and is a good steward of the resources that have been entrusted to them by the shareholders and investors. And the fourth principle is you can't have a conscious business unless you create conscious culture. The strategies, the processes, and the structures that compose the culture have to be consciously created in such a way that they allow the enterprise to fulfill its purpose and to create value for all these interdependent stakeholders.
Can you say some more about this culture creation, how you do that at Whole Foods Markets?
Well, the way I think about it is that it starts with that purpose in the center, and then the stakeholders radiate out like spokes on a wheel and are connected to that purpose. And then the culture aspects are all the things that unite the stakeholders to the fulfillment of the purpose, so the purpose satisfying the stakeholders. And the culture are means, structures, processes, strategies to do that. How do we create that at Whole Foods? We co-create it. The stakeholders involved in that creation. But once you've internalized that purpose and once you have a stakeholder model, then you can examine the culture that exists and say that's not really serving us in terms of our mission or our purpose or in terms of creating value for stakeholders. So we've got to evolve that or get rid of that. And this type of strategy, so for example, Whole Foods is organized into teams, into self-managing work teams. And that helps the team members, the employees, we call team members at Whole Foods, that helps them to flourish. And if they flourish, if they're happy in their work and they're creative, and that helps them to serve the customers better. Of course, if they're serving the customers better, the business is going to flourish, and that'll serve the investors because the business will be more profitable. So by having that type of team structure, that's a cultural, organizational value at our company that helps serve the purpose and the stakeholder groups. There's literally dozens and dozens, perhaps even hundreds, of cultural aspects of Whole Foods that have evolved over time that serve the mission and the stakeholder model.
So what's your role at Whole Foods now? You've built this thing. You have a lot of passion about the company. You have a lot of passion in telling this new story about conscious capitalism. What's your role now as sort of the leader of Whole Foods? You've got this thing running, and it's a terrific place.
Well, thank you. It's an interesting question because, in truth, my role has continued to evolve over time, and I always ask, what's the unique value that I can create for the company? What can I do in my role with my talents and my strengths that can best serve the company the best? And a big part of my job remains strategic and thinking about the business, particularly thinking about the future of the business, how the business needs to evolve, and what needs to change in order for it to evolve. So I am a creative individual, and I do come up with lots of creative ideas that help evolve the company forward. So that's a big part of my job. Also, I am the only co-founder left, and I have a figurehead role in a sense that it's particularly valuable for me to travel around to the stores and interact with the team members and the suppliers I might meet and the customers I meet, because they get really excited to meet me. It's like I'm the father, and so I found that to be very good for morale, and it's stimulating to me to interact. If you sit in your office in Austin, you're in an ivory tower. When you get around and travel and you see the stores, and interact with the team members in the company and the customers and the suppliers and occasionally investors as well, that stimulates my own thinking and proves to be valuable for the overall morale of the organization. So that's a big part of what I do. I also talk to investors. I talk to all the stakeholders. I mean,
I was very lucky to go to Whole Foods with you while you've been here and to see that process. And what stood out for me was not only did the team members really happy to see you, but there was a very human interaction. It wasn't the CEO and co-founder who's on some different plane than I am. It was seeing you as a team member that cared about them. Is that the normal way, in your experience, most businesses and most CEOs work?
I don't know. I don't know how most CEOs interact. I only know how I interact. And I'm not want to pass judgment on other CEOs. I just try to be authentic. I just try to show up and be who I am. And that sometimes frustrates people because they have an idea in their minds of how a CEO should be.
Right.
And although they themselves have never been a CEO, they're quick to lecture me on how a CEO should be. I always find that rather amusing. It's not so much the team members do it, but I do hear it occasionally that he's not acting the way a CEO should act. And I don't know how a CEO is supposed to act. I only know who I am. And I think it's important to be as transparent and as authentic as I can be whenever I'm in any interaction. I do think that's, for most people, do find that refreshing, even if they have some judgments about it. So probably what you witnessed when we were touring around is the team members aren't afraid of me.
Right.
And I try to connect on a heart level with them. I think that the whole emotion of love is greatly underestimated and somewhat feared in corporate America based on what I've seen. I do think that's an incredibly important virtue. And so I do try to interact from my heart and connect with people. And the team members sense that I care about them because I do.
Let's explore that sort of theme of being authentic, because it's absolutely who you are, as I've told you before. But you've gotten a lot of criticism in the press over the last year, and the press wants to put you in a particular category of CEOs ought to believe this, or they ought to act like that. And so some of that comes off as controversial.
Yes.
How do you deal with that? You know, you've been called everything under the sun. How do you deal with the media when you're trying to be you, but you don't fit in the nice categories that the media have for you?
I can't do anything about other people's interpretations and how they spin things. And it's paradoxical that on the one hand, the media says they want people to be authentic. On the other hand, when a real authentic person shows up that doesn't fit into their categories, they can be viciously attacked. I have experienced that personally, and I say it's not much fun. But then I tend not to read it, and don't pay that much attention to it. So I think we have our culture on the one hand really wants to have authentic leadership. We don't have authentic leadership at the political level, for example. I experience our politicians routinely lying.
Both sides.
To us. Both sides, not Democratic or Republicans, both lie and spin things and that kind of reflects a lack of trust. They're basically saying, I can't really say what I believe because it'd freak you out, so I'm not going to do it. So I'm going to spin things and I'm going to tell comforting things. And I personally am very cynical about it as a result. So I do think the culture is crying out for authenticity and honesty and sincerity in leadership. But when it does happen, it also is very threatening to people. So because it doesn't fit into their categories. So I have this, because I do try to be authentic and show up as who I am, I either have a blessing or a curse, depending on your perspective, is that I rile things up. People get all upset, and I create controversy. I don't want to create controversy, but it just tends to happen.
I'm not sure that's bad. I think sometimes light comes from heat, and we need.
If you don't burn up first.
If you don't burn up first, I think that's right. John, you've often. Again, labels are tricky things, but you've often identified yourself as a libertarian, as have I. And people wonder how, in their common understanding of being a libertarian, you can talk about things like purpose and stakeholders, and you can talk about capitalism in terms of, the way I would put it, the greatest system of social cooperation we've ever invented. It's how we create value for each other and trade with each other. Competition's important, but it's not the cornerstone, it seems to me. What does your understanding of libertarian bring to thinking about business? Because it seems contradictory to the things that I know Whole Foods stands for. Can you help resolve the paradox, the apparent paradox there?
Well, I think people don't understand what libertarianism is. I mean, they're dealing with a projection rather than its essence. In essence, libertarianism is about maximizing human freedom. It's belief that when humans are free, they're most creative. They take self-responsibility for their own lives, and that we can create a society of free individuals who voluntarily cooperate together to create value for each other. So I don't see any contradictions. I understand that people oftentimes see libertarian in a less than flattering way, and oftentimes I try increasingly not to self-identify as a libertarian because I'm having to deal with so much prejudice and biases that. So I actually now people ask me, I'll say, well, I'm actually a classical liberal. And the Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, Friedrich von Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, Milton Friedman tradition of society. Or, increasingly, I'll call myself a conscious capitalist. I actually prefer that one best of all because then people ask me, well, what the heck is that? And that gives me a chance to talk about some of the things I've been talking about with you today.
John, recently there have been a lot of critiques of business schools.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Given your experience, if you were going to start the John Mackey School of Business, what would you be sure the students were exposed to in that?
Well, first we'd have to change the name. I wouldn't be comfortable naming it after myself. And I've never been to business school, but I have certainly met lots of business professors, and I've talked at least 15 or so business schools. So I've begun to fathom some perspective on what they do things. I do have some suggestions, if that's what you're asking. Well, I do think business schools have a tendency to select for and teach a certain type of intelligence, what I call analytical intelligence, which is, as far as it goes, valuable. And I'm not suggesting that's not important skills. It is important that people be able to think analytically, that they be able to logically analyze things. And so they do lots of case study analysis, for example. And that's just fine as far as it goes, but I do think the 21st century business school is going to need to evolve and understand that business success in the 21st century requires a lot richer set of skills. And if, not in any particular order, but some of the other skills that need to be taught and are communication skills and primarily listening skills. I think those are essential skills to develop. I think emotional intelligence is, I always say that a better predictor of leadership excellence is less analytical skills than emotional intelligence, because a business organization is about relationships. And without a high degree of emotional intelligence, no matter how brilliant you are, you won't reach your full potential, and neither will the organization. And yet I don't think that's something business schools have focused enough on. They call that the soft side. And yet, I think that's almost pejorative.
Oh, it is pejorative, yeah.
So
the real stuff's the analytical stuff,
yeah.
And the soft side of how you actually get people to work together to create value for each other.
Exactly.
That's
so emotional intelligence, social intelligence, communication skills, what I would call spiritual intelligence. And what I mean by that is primarily the ability or the skill set to be able to perceive purpose and meaning. That's actually, I believe, a type of intelligence that can be cultivated and can be learned. I also think it's essential that business schools what I call the systems mind. Again, analytical intelligence breaks things down into its parts, but there's a whole other way to perceive things, which is to be able to perceive the relationships that exist between things. That, if you're going to, in a larger organization, or if you're going to build an organization, you have to be able to perceive the relationships that exist, for example, between the stakeholders.
And how the whole context affects those particular relationships as well.
I mean, an analogy would be if you go to a medical school, the first class you take in your first year of medical school is you take gross anatomy, and you learn how you analyze, you take a cadaver and you dissect it. And you see the different parts of the cadaver. Again, analytical skills are important, but that's a dead cadaver. You're not seeing the relationships of how these organs interact with each other in such a way as to create health. And in organizations, there's a systems mind that sees how the organization flourishes and the relationships that must exist between these so-called different parts. Again, we're back to thinking in terms of synergies rather than trade-offs. The analytical mind is quick to see trade-offs. The systems mind is quicker to see synergies. And that's a certain level of consciousness that needs to be developed. And I think it's essential for 21st century business. My final point of what I would teach in those business schools is I do think ethics is extremely important, and I do not think people need a theoretical basis of ethics, but I also think they need to have that internalized, that we take that for granted. And our society no longer, for the most part, we're not in a religious context anymore, and ethics are something that no one is taking responsibility for. So I don't think people should be going through business schools without strong grounding in ethics.
Hopefully there'll be a lot of young people in the YouTube generation who see this. Hopefully someone, maybe you, maybe me, maybe others, will inspire them to start a business. Any advice for them as they think about whether to do that or not? What kind of business to start?
Well, my first advice that I always give to young people is I do talk at a lot of business schools, and I oftentimes will ask, how many people here someday plan to open their own business? And surprisingly, I get half.
You get a lot of hands.
I get a lot of hands, half to 3/4.
Yeah.
But my follow-up question is, how many of you plan to start a business immediately after school? Very few.
Why is that, do you think?
I think most of them owe a lot of money.
Loans, yeah.
Yeah, they got to pay it back. But they have a fantasy of doing their own business, but they're not quite ready to do it. And my first piece of advice is that young people don't realize this, but life actually goes by pretty fast. And it's too short to do anything less than following your passions, to follow your heart. Things that you deeply care about are the things that you should involve your life energies in. You shouldn't be preparing, in a sense, to follow your passions later, because you may end up getting trapped in a job or a career that doesn't really engage your deepest passions, the things you care most about, and you do it simply to make money. And again, there's nothing wrong with making money. I think that's a very good thing. But for people that want to start their own businesses, most entrepreneurs just go out and do it. I mean, if you look at the great entrepreneurs of my generation, people like Bill Gates and Michael Dell and Stephen Jobs, they were on fire and they just went out and did their businesses. And so follow your passions, follow your heart, follow your bliss, however you want to call it, I think is a key strategy for not only business, but for life.
I tell people I teach business ethics, and they say, I didn't know business had any.
Right.
They go oxymoron or jumbo shrimp. They go must be a short course, must be theoretical course. This idea that business occupies the moral low ground in society, especially given the current economic crisis. Public trust in business is at an all-time low. Help us understand what to do about that.
Well, I'd like to start out by saying that almost all the institutions in our society are at an all-time low in terms of trust, not just business.
That's right.
But our educational system is, our healthcare system is, our trust in government is at an all-time low.
Business just on the bottom of those.
Yes.
But that's right. You're
But what
absolutely right.
all of these have in common, including and maybe particularly especially business, is they've forgotten or never have really known what their purpose was and why they exist. And business particularly is handicapped by this narrow, this very limited narrative that they're primarily there to maximize profits and shareholder value. And that's not a very noble purpose. It's not necessarily wrong or evil. I don't think it is. I do believe in the invisible hand and Adam Smith's metaphor there,
and you got to make money to survive.
Yes.
But it'd be like saying the purpose of life is to make red blood cells. You got to
Yes.
have them to survive, but
Or
not
the-
the purpose. Really.
Or as a grocer, the purpose of life is to eat.
Right.
Rather than, I must eat in order to live, but I don't live in order to eat. And same thing with breath. I mean, so the purpose obviously is much bigger than that. And so I think that's the main reason why all these institutions are lack of trust, is because the institution has narrowed its purpose to self-interest. And we see politicians who are lining their own pockets. We see educational systems that are They're primarily for the teachers' unions or the administration rather than what's best for the students.
Or you see universities that think they exist for the faculty,
Yes.
as opposed to the students and the other stakeholders.
Exactly. So all the institutions, particularly I say business, need to get back to examining why they exist, what their purpose is, what their function is, how do they serve society, how they serve others, because that's what people want. They want businesses to be more than profit machines. They want businesses that care about their customers, who care about their workers, who care about the environment, who care about doing the right thing with their suppliers. They want business to be good. And it can't be good if it doesn't know what its purpose is. It too often behaves like a sociopath who's only in it for themselves. And that's how most people see business, is only in it for themselves. Corporations in particular have a larger brand that is perceived as fundamentally evil, sociopathic. And I find it at Whole Foods, we're constantly lumped into that. Well, you're a corporation.
Yeah, so wink, wink, nudge, nudge, you must be in it for the money,
and so
really.
People forever questioning everything we do. It's like, well, you're doing that. It looks like you're doing something good there, but we know that's just a clever greenwashing trick. The cynicism is so deep that even when a business like Whole Foods Market, which demonstrably for 30 plus years has existed to fulfill its purpose and has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of examples of doing that, the cynicism and lack of trust is so great, people refuse to believe it. And so we're constantly being attacked. We're called to be hypocrites, or if we make money, if you're a corporation, you're guilty. But the worst kind of corporation is one that's really successful and making a lot of money. Because again, in the larger society narrative, if you're making money, then you must be exploiting someone else.
Plus, it seems to me you don't get room to make mistakes. Right? You make a mistake, the mistake gets turned into, oh, see, they're really doing it for the money.
Exactly. So I do think that the way to combat that over time is for all the institutions, particularly corporations and business, to discover purpose and communicate purpose, and then live up to that purpose. You have to walk the talk. You can't just put it out there. You have to really believe it, live it, create and design your company culture around it. If we do that, the trust in business will begin to go back up again.
How do you do that in a company? How do you build trust and engage people so they show up every day, they feel like they're empowered, and you create a high trust organization?
That's a complex question because there's so many variables that go into that. I mean, I think purpose is one. Secondly, the leadership has got to walk the talk. People examine the leaders to see if they really mean it or not, or whether or not they mouth a philosophy but then don't live it. So leadership by example is essential to creating trust. But I also think an organization needs to empower its workers, and I think that leads to trust. We tend to trust people who we feel care about us. So I do think it's essential that organizations create cultures based on love and care. If we really want to have a high trust organization, you have to be comfortable with the idea that love and care have to be abundant within the culture and within the organization. And that somehow contradicts a lot of the current narrative about business, which is that's all very good, but sometimes you got to make the tough but necessary decisions. And so we don't have any place for that. We'll get slaughtered competitively if we adopt that kind of philosophy.
Doesn't contradict Adam Smith. Adam Smith wrote about moral sentiments. He wrote about the markets work because they're people of justice. He had a sense of justice. And I think he would include in that what you're talking about love and care.
I totally agree, but who reads the theory of moral sentiments today, or who even reads, for that matter, The Wealth of Nations? So Adam Smith has been caricatured and not really fully understood. I mean, in some ways, Adam Smith was hundreds of years ahead of his time, and a lot of his original ideas that he had are still very applicable to the 21st century and could really help us if we would take it seriously. I think another important quality about creating a high trust organization is the importance of transparency. Too many companies do not have a culture of transparency because they're so afraid, because they don't trust their workers, that the information is going to migrate to their competitors. So they have kind of a philosophy of on a need-to-know basis. And I think it's far better to be transparent, knowing that some of the information may leak out to your competitors, but that is worth taking that risk in order to create a high-trust organization. So that, and some of the things Whole Foods does that maximize transparency in our company, for example, what everybody gets paid that's open information. We communicate as much financial information as we possibly can in order to, so people will know how the company's doing. We have transparency as an ethic, and so we try to think through every area of our company and ask, how can we make this more transparent? How can we make communication clearer and without spin on it? Too many companies also try to spin things. Their public relations departments are forever attempting to put forth an image. Again, you've moved away from authenticity when you are spinning things. So I think it's essential that businesses try to be as transparent and as authentic as possible. Those greatly enhance creating a culture of trust.